And good morning. I hope you're doing well. Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from a cold morning here on the Campbell University campus. I'm sitting here alone in the classroom, so I'm guessing that everybody got the announcement and decided to bail on class today. If you're in the live chat right now, go ahead and type a hello in the chat bar to let me know that you're here. If not, I'll just go on. So, I did want to tell you that we have an exam coming, or excuse me, a quiz coming up this weekend. Not an exam, just a quiz to sort of see if you're figuring out my study method and the kind of things I'm talking about. I see Delaney O'Brien is in the house today. Good morning, Delaney. Thank you for coming today. Hopefully you can hear everything. But yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the exam today and talk a little bit about Chapter 3. We didn't get to cover it completely last class, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about it. Oh, hi, Ciara. Thanks for coming today. Welcome to my broadcast. Fantastic. We are going to have a couple of audience members today. I'm excited to hear that. Okay, cool. So what I wanted to do quickly is to show you the review sheet that we're going to be using. Okay, so let's see, where is it? All right, if you'll come with me to the, let's see, screen share. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. Yeah, absolutely you can. So this is the Blackboard folder that we, for our class. And if you click in the quiz and exam folder, you're going to notice it's right here. This is the online video review for the quiz 1. The video that I'm recording right now, this will be the link for that video when you need it. And then, quiz review notes. Let's go ahead and make those available to the students. Okay. Boom, right there. So these are the quiz review notes. So this is the online video review with this recording. These are the review notes, and this is the exam. And you can find this all in the exam and quiz folder. Okay, so let's go to the quiz review notes real quick. And look, the quiz includes 26 multiple choice, short answer, true, false, and matching questions, Delaney and Ciara. You do have 30 minutes to complete the exam. This is a proctored exam. You'll be using the proctoring software for this, and the use of books, notes, and other electronic tools is specifically prohibited. Okay? Don't forget that this is also due Sunday night by 11:59 p.m. So let's go over and talk about what's going to be on the exam. If you look for Chapter 1, I do want you to understand the basics of social psychology. I want you to know what a construal is, what a schema is, and the differences between controlled and automatic processing. So, can one of you ladies that's on the broadcast, does either one of you know what a construal is? If you know, go ahead and type it in the chat bar. I don't know if we have anybody else on the broadcast. If you want to, feel free to type it in the chat bar. But I'm going to want you to know what a construal is and maybe even be able to give me an example of a construal. Okay? Chapter 1 also talks about controlled and automatic processing. And as I'm going to try to convince you this semester, a lot of our processing is automatic. Okay? It occurs thoughtlessly. Construal is the interpretation or inference about a stimuli or situation that one confronts. Dang, that sounds really good, Delaney. Exactly. It's your interpretation of the event. So even though I'm sitting here in a classroom by myself, we have created a construal of a class because I have some students online. And so there are certain things that are appropriate in this situation that are not appropriate in other situations. Be able to give me an example of a construal as well, Delaney. Okay, we also talked a little bit about the seminarians in the Samaritan study that figures prominently in Chapter 1. I'm going to ask you a basic question about that, which demonstrates these concepts listed in item number 1. Let's see. Also, we talked about dispositional and situational causes of behavior. We people do things, and sometimes the reasons that people do things are dispositional, and sometimes the reason that people do things are situational. I'm going to give you some examples, and I want you to tell me which ones represent situational causes and which represent dispositional causes. Do any of you, Delaney, can you tell me, let's say a student, a teacher comes up to you and smiles and says you're a very smart student, Delaney. What is a dispositional explanation for that behavior? If somebody comes up and, let's say not a teacher, I'm a teacher, I was going to say that. What if somebody comes up and gives you a compliment? What is a dispositional reason for their behavior? And conversely, what is a situational explanation for their behavior? I do want you to be able to do that in the exam. If you want to type an example in the chat bar, I'll look at it. But don't worry if you don't want to. I am going to ask you about the fundamental attribution error. Most time, people focus on the dispositional causes of behavior and not the situational causes of behavior, okay? So read about that in chapter 1. And then I want you to tell me, what is weird? What do we mean by the concept weird? What is it and why is it important? They'll talk about that in chapter 1 as well, and that is also on the exam. Okay, so the basics of social psychology. I want you to know what a construal is, what a schema is, the difference between automatic and controlled processing, an example of these construals. I want you to know the results of the seminarian versus Samaritan study. You have to be able to tell me the difference between a situational and a dispositional cause of behavior. I want you to know the definition of a fundamental attribution error, and I want you to know why weird samples are important. Do you have any questions about chapter 1? Any questions? Disposition of your personality, where situational is an explanation based on given circumstances. Wow, that is an absolutely awesome answer, Ciara. You are quite right. So dispositional has to do with your personality. So if I come up and compliment you, a dispositional attribution might be I'm a nice, polite person. A situational attribution might be that I'm playing the role of a warm, friendly teacher, and that's the role I'm playing, but it's not really who I am. Sierra, great example of that. Okay? So that's pretty much the totality for chapter 1. I see we have a few more people on the broadcast. If you just logged in, ooh, sorry, when I move this camera kind of changes the focus. If you just logged in, go ahead and type a hello in the chat bar so I'll know you're here. Thanks for coming. I really do. Okay, so we just finished talking about chapter 1. So if we could, let's go back to the quiz review notes. So for those of you who just joined the broadcast, the quiz review notes are in the exam and quiz folder. Quiz review notes right here. Okay. So chapter 2. Chapter 2 is all about research methods. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that you can see it. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so chapter 2 and I have a misspelling here, observational. So we talked about different methods of gathering data in chapter 2. And I suggested to you that there were a lot of ways of gathering data that allow us to sort of observe and make statements about groups of people. Without actually looking for relationships. We talked about observational studies, we talked about surveys, we talked about archival studies. If you remember, I suggested to you that archival studies are studies that use data collected by somebody else for a different purpose. Okay, so if you go and look at FBI data to look at homicide rates, or if you look at rates of accidents or rates of spousal abuse, as reported in federal crime statistics, you're using archival data. The difference between sort of archival studies and surveys is that the survey data was collected by the experimenter for this given purpose, right? So that's the difference between the survey and an archival study. Now, we talked about observational studies, laboratory and naturalistic observations. Probably one of the most famous observational studies ever done was by Stanley Milgram. And we talked about that in chapter 1. That is an observational study. He didn't manipulate anything. He just wanted to see if he could make people behave in a violent manner through coercion. So that was sort of what we might call a laboratory observational study. So I do want you to know the difference between these. I think I have a matching question where you try to match these different study methods with descriptions of them. Okay, so that's for part 1. Now, we did talk also about correlations and experiments. Correlations and true experiments are different than observational surveys and archival studies, in that typically what we're attempting to do is establish relationships among variables. You might do that in a survey or in archival studies, but those are a lot of times when we're just trying to look at a population of people. But in experiments and correlations, we're trying to draw relationships between variables, okay? So I do want you to know the difference between a correlation and an experiment. Which one of those two studies can demonstrate cause and why? Okay, I'm going to ask you that question right now. I want somebody to type in the chat bar. What is the difference between correlations and experiments, and why is that difference there? I forget the question I just asked you. Oops. But I do want you to know how experiments are different than correlations. Does anybody know? Okay. Now, I'm also going to ask you a couple of questions that demonstrate your knowledge of the parts of an experiment. You're going to have to know what an independent variable is, what a dependent variable, and what random assignment is. Why is random so important in an experiment? I want you to know that for the quiz. Okay? Now, we talked about correlations, which are measurements that we make between naturally co-occurring variables to see if they relate to one another. I think in class that day I was talking about smoking behavior in cancer. Remember, we can't do a true experiment with smoking because we can't randomly assign people to smoke or not to smoke. That's unethical. You can't harm people. However, we can go out and ask people who have already decided to smoke. We can go out and look at those people and measure outcomes, health outcomes related to them. And so we can see a relationship between certain behaviors and certain outcomes. Now remember, in the smoking study, we can't manipulate behaviors, so we have to look at pre-existing categories and pre-existing variables. And this is sort of a weakness for the correlation because you can't demonstrate cause unless you can use random assignment. Okay? So I do want you to know that. Now, I will provide you with some examples of positive and negative correlations, and I want you to be able to tell me if a statement represents a positive correlation or a negative correlation. Quick quiz. Let's see. People who eat more fried food tend to have a higher BMI. Is that a positive or a negative correlation? What do you think? I'd be curious to see if you know the difference. So I'll give you some examples like that, and you're going to have to know what a positive relationship looks like and what a negative relationship looks like. Let's see. Excuse me, I got something in my eye. Okay, let's see. And then I've also got some questions on ethics. I just want you to know what an AAIRB board is. It's the board that's in charge of evaluating research studies to make sure they follow ethical guidelines. I want you to know what an informed consent is. I want you to know what debriefing is. What is open science and why is it important? Your book talks about that, so I do want you to spend some time looking at that in chapter 2. And then I want you to tell me, when is deception acceptable? Is it acceptable sometimes, always, or never? And if it's sometimes, under what conditions would it be acceptable? Okay? So read about, and there are bolded items for all 4 of these terms in your textbook, so it should be easy for you to find them in your textbook to read about. Okay. So, does anybody have any questions so far? I noticed we've got a few more viewers, still no participants. You know, I noticed you were a quiet class even when you're sitting in class with me. I figured you wouldn't type in the chat bar. So I guess we have some people here. Okay. So that's chapter 1 and 2. I'm going to wait and make sure that we don't have any questions. Fantastic. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do for this next part is I'm actually going to switch. Let's see, that's to the PowerPoint. Let's go to the PowerPoint. This is the PowerPoint that I put in your Chapter 3 materials. Since we didn't talk about all of this material, I'm going to sort of refer back to it for this lecture. Hopefully you can see that. Okay. So, if you remember, I suggested to you, and we watched that video on Tuesday, suggesting to you that what you think of as this organic self that exists in you, this belief about yourself, it's imaginary. It's a system. It's a construct. It's a construal, if you will. It is a construal. That means yourself may or may not even exist. Now, your chapter intro is going to talk about William James. He was sort of the first major psychologist. They call him the father of American psychology. And he sort of was the first person to differentiate this idea that people's selves are sort of categories that they think about. And so he talked about different kinds of self. So he represents sort of a prelude to the scientific research on the study of self. Okay? Now remember, I tried to introduce you to this idea of a self schema. It's this big knowledge structure. It's something you make based on your experiences, your beliefs, your memories, and whatever. Now, if you remember, I suggested to you that schemas are automatic. We can't change them. They're hard to do anything with. Your self schema is a very it's a very complex, integrated, and crystallized thing. It's hard to change your basic sense of self. And more importantly, what was I going to say about your sense of self? Oh, and the deal is, if you remember, since we suggested that a self doesn't really actually exist, all right, since it doesn't actually exist, and it's this imagined fiction that we have, keep in mind that your self doesn't necessarily have to be accurate. Beautiful people think they're ugly. Skinny people think they're fat. Smart people think they're dumb. People all the time have incorrect views of the self. So although this self schema is strong and it's crystallized, it doesn't always have to be accurate, right? Now, if you'll notice here on this page, I mentioned Marcus. If you remember, I talked about Marcus a little bit on Tuesday, and I suggested to you that she said that you can think of some aspects of the self as being more chronically accessible than others. And she actually, the term they used in the book was the working self concept. It's the self that you bring up day to day. So you have lots of memories and beliefs and ideas about who you are. Your self is very complex and very big, but you only think of a subset of those things every day. That's what we might call your working self concept or your chronically accessible self schema. And if you'll remember, Hazel Marcus did that research where she looked at people who were schematic or not schematic for traits. And if you'll remember, she said that people who are schematic for traits, that means if those traits are important for them, those people are able to make quicker self-related judgments if it relates to these schema items, right? So those of you, I notice we have several athletes in the class that sit up front, and we've got football players, soccer players. I can't think of your names right now because I'm stressed out looking at a camera. But if I was to ask you about athleticism, that's probably schematic for you. So you're going to be able to make judgments related to the sports schema about yourself much faster than people who are not schematic for that trait. Now, I didn't mention this to you in class, but it is important for the quiz. It is important for the quiz. It is important for the quiz. Hazel Marcus also found that people who are schematic for a trait are more likely to reject other people's opinions who say they aren't schematic for the trait. So let's say I'm not much into music. If somebody comes up and tells me I'm a musical or a non-musical person, I'm more likely to accept that judgment of me than if I am schematic for the trait. I know I hate music. So if you come up and say that to me, being schematic for a trait allows me, A, to make a quicker judgment about myself in any given dimension, and also people are more likely to reject labels that don't fit with a schematic trait. I hope that made sense. All right. We did talk about the working self-concept, and remember, I shortened it from Padawan Singer to Singer. I do want you to know the McGuire and Singer research. If you remember, they found that most people, that school children tended to describe themselves, American school children tended to describe themselves in qualities that differentiated them from their classmates. So if you were the only athlete in the class, that's the part of yourself you wanted to talk about. If you were the only minority in the class, that's what you wanted to talk about. If you were the only foreign student, that's the part of yourself that you would accentuate. And so McGuire and Singer found that there's sort of a motivation for people to stand out. And so this self-schema that we have, we can move around that self-schema as we need to, and sometimes we do it in an effort to stand out, to be unique, if you will. Okay? Now, we did talk about culture and self, and that is also on this quiz, right? I talked to you about the interdependent versus the independent self-construals, and we have this little graph right here that I found on the internet. People with an interdependent view of the self tend to think of themselves as being separate and unique and not a part of the people and groups that surround them. On the other hand, the interdependent self-concept views other people as part of the self, if you will. Remember, the self is a schema. It's a construction in your mind. So when I say that you view other people as part of yourself, I'm not, trying to be ridiculous or religious or shamanistic. I'm just saying that the way some people actually conceptualize themselves includes other people as part of their individual unit, right? Now, we talked about the cultural differences. Typically, you're going to, this research, early research, looked at the difference between Asian and Western cultures. That's been a long-standing stereotype that Asian people are more group-oriented and Westerns are more independent oriented. And the research, to a certain extent, has supported that different view of the self. And so you'll see the studies here, Cotton and Guns on 2002. Remember, I told you about that study. Asian students are more likely to describe an embarrassing event from other people's perspective and how they were looking at that person. And the Canadian people talking about an embarrassing event talked about how they felt, not necessarily how the people watching them responded, representing more of an internal and individualistic focus, right? And I didn't talk about this, but it is in your textbook. The Masuda et al. Research, they found, so what you do is you have people judge facial emotions. Humans are pretty good at judging facial emotions. I'm happy. I'm mad. I'm angry. I'm sad. These are my different facial emotions, and you are good at judging them. What they found is that from Asian cultures, they pay more attention. So what they did was they would have people show faces alone or within a group of people, and those group of people would either have the same emotion or a different emotion. And what they found is that for the Asian participants, when there was context, the Asian participants tended to take the context into account when judging the target's emotion, whereas the American, the Western participants tended to focus only on the person who they were asked to judge. Both of these suggest that maybe Eastern cultures have a more interdependent view of the self than do Western cultures. Now, again, that research started out based on stereotypes about Asians and Americans, but really you can look around the world and there are interdependent cultures everywhere. And so you'll look at you'll see interdependent cultures in South America, and your research in here talks about interdependent cultures in Africa. And so I'm actually interested in you knowing the Mon-Schoenman study too. And the idea is that some cultures just seem to accentuate the interconnected nature of life. And this actually affects how people think about themselves. Now, we talked also, culture goes from country to country, but it also goes from gender to gender, state to state, locale to locale. And so the other big cultural difference that you're going to find in this book is that idea of gender differences as well. And what they're suggesting to you is that female self-construals tend to be more interdependent than do Western female construals tend to be more interdependent than do Western male construals. And your book's going to talk about where this comes from. And in fact, I showed you the video on Tuesday. You saw how the adult was training what they thought to be the female to play with dollies, to accentuate their caring aspect of life, where when they thought the baby was a male, they focused on building spatial awareness, independent kind of things. And so you can think of culture, the media, all of these things amplifying sort of the way that males and females think about something as basic as the self. So I do want you to know that culture does affect the self-construals as well. I think I've got one, maybe two questions about that on the exam. And I talked about this as well, the 25 behaviors study. And the upshot of this is that sometimes we are not as accurate as we think when it comes to judging ourselves. There's a concept I didn't talk about in class. It's called this idea of reflected self-appraisal. You are sometimes you construct aspects of yourself based upon what other people say you are. Okay? And so what you're going to find is that young kids often their true self will be different from their reflected self-appraisal, because they will buy into what other people say they are. And the research shows that the difference between reflected appraisals and self-appraisals, other people's judgments of you and yourself, they get more similar as time goes on. When people become comfortable with their own skin and their judgment of themselves tends to become more similar to their beliefs of what people think they are. Now, people don't change one way or the other, but what happens is after a while, your own sense of self seems to overwhelm you, and those independent judgments that you thought people had about you, you start changing them so they're more consistent with your sense of self. One of the things I will tell you is, as you get older, moving into your 20s and 30s and 40s, what other people say about you and what other people think about you becomes less and less important as you become more confident in your own self-narrative. And yes, it sucks to get old. My bones ache. I'm a little overweight. The doctor might want to put me on medicine, but you know what? I feel better and more comfortable in my own skin than I ever felt as a 20-year-old. And this is sort of because we quit buying into this. Reflected self-appraisal becomes more accurate as we get older. Okay, now we didn't talk about social comparison theory. This is probably one of the oldest and most famous studies in social psychology. A fellow named Leon Festinger, who did several different interesting areas of research that we're going to focus on, talked about people's comparisons. I don't know about you, but all of us spend our time looking at others and comparing ourselves to others. It's just natural, right? It starts in first grade when your teachers start telling you who's the better student. You get put in you get put in the elephants reading group versus the lions reading group. You play sports and you learn who wins a game and who loses a game. You start to see people having things and you want this video game and that video game, but Ryan has it or Sheila has it or whatever. We spend an awful lot of times evaluating ourselves by comparing ourselves to others. And social comparison theory talks about this human tendency that we all have and its implications for our well-being. Now, two types of comparison. In an upward comparison, you compare somebody to who is more accomplished than you, right? And this is kind of what you do maybe when you're trying to get better at something. But a lot of times people like to engage in what we call downward comparison. Don't you love to talk about that couple that's not doing as good as you and your boyfriend or girlfriend? Don't you like to talk about that school or those students that are not doing as good as your school or your students, right? And this is called downward comparison. Now, upward comparison can lead us to feelings of dejection. And in fact, there is lots of research to suggest that social media usage, looking at Instagram stories and Facebook stories and other social media stories, will only make you sad. They create depressing feelings in you. Every time I go into YouTube, I see this big beefy guy that says, if you make $150,000 and you're not jacked, your life is miserable. And you know what? I am neither jacked nor do I make $150,000 a year. So every time I see this guy's video, I compare myself up, and it makes me feel just a little bit negative about myself. Think about all the time you spend on social media and what it does to your brain, because nobody ever shows you the bad stuff on social media. It's always their best life, right? Now, research has shown that in an academic setting, in settings where it matters, people will tend to choose upward comparison. But if it doesn't really matter, people always choose, if they're given an opportunity, downward comparison makes people feel better, right? And people really, the comparisons that people love the best is that person who's just about your level. I'm not going to compare myself with Tom Cruise. There's no comparison. He's worth $1 billion and is loved and thought to be beautiful by everyone in the world. I'm just Dr. Roddenberry. It doesn't make as much sense to compare myself with him or the local homeless guy. I'm really going to want to compare myself with people who are similar and in an achievement setting slightly better than me. So I do want you to know about the negative effects of spending time on social media. Now, self-esteem is part of your schema. You don't think about this, okay? When I asked you to write your self-schema down on Tuesday, you didn't write these things down saying, well, you didn't write, I hate myself down there. None of you wrote that. You wrote concrete things about yourself, histories of yourself. But each and every one of you feels a certain way about yourself. You may like yourself, you may hate yourself. That value, that part of your schema, let's call your self-esteem. The weird thing about self-esteem is you have a pretty much what we call a trait self-esteem. That's who I am as a person. But based on feedback any given day, my feelings about myself bump up and down a little bit, right? That's what we call trait self-esteem. What psychologists are more interested in is trait self-esteem, right? Now, the weird thing is, self-esteem does not make you a more successful person per se. However, people with higher self-esteem are less depressed and spend more time in the face of failure. People with low self-esteem give up quickly. People with high self-esteem can be obnoxiously persistent. And so that's where self-esteem may lead to success. But self-esteem is just a part of your schema, and it's a feeling about who you are. Now, weird thing you may or may not know, males tend to have higher self-esteem than do females. Go figure, right? Your self-esteem is never higher than it is as a 9-year-old kid. If you remember your teenage years, girls didn't like you or boys didn't like you, you got bad grades, people teased you, bullied you. Look at this drop in self-esteem that happens over your teenage years. And self-esteem never really recovers until you get to be Dr. Roddenberry's age. Now I love myself, right? But you'll notice that there's this weird pattern. Self-esteem changes across the lifespan. Does anybody have an idea why do men have more self-esteem than women? You might want to take a look at that and consider that. So I do want you to know about self-esteem and self-esteem. Why do we have self-esteem? There are lots of different theories. Mark Leary believes that self-esteem tells you whether or not you're fitting into the group. If you start to have low self-esteem, to him, it sort of serves this evolutionary purpose. It tells you that you need to change your behavior so people will accept you, right? And then if you look down here, the self-discrepancy theory, it sort of tells you if you are following along the right track. Think about your future self. Well, and compare that to your actual self. You have what you might call an ideal self, the self I want to be. And then you have an ought self, the self your parents tell you you should be. And what we find is that when people aren't meeting these obligations, it causes emotions in them. So you might think of your self-esteem as a way of directing your behavior for promotion and achievement, right? So, let's see. And then I did suggest to you that human beings have what we call positive illusions. If I pointed this out in Tuesday's class, none of you wrote anything negative about yourself in your self-descriptions. Chapter 3 is going to tell you that when given the opportunity, most people will say they are above average in everything. Better looking than average, smarter than average, better drivers than average, Statistically speaking, that is a lie. Can't be. Can't be. But people like to say that sometimes. And it's because feeling good about this self helps us function in the world. And here on this page, I want you to see all the ways in which people artificially inflate their self-esteem and their feelings of themselves. We use self-serving attributions. If you do something and it turns out well, people like to take credit. If you do something and it turns out poorly, people tend to make an external attribution. Wasn't my fault. Sheila did it. The test was unfair. Blah, blah, blah. Some of you who don't do well on this exam will probably blame this snow day for the problem. Those of you who do well will say, I'm a genius, right? People tend to think that they are unique. Remember, we talked about the working self concept. People like to describe self in ways that make them unique. False consensus. People like to think that everybody believes the way they believe, right? And one way to help the self that this fellow Claude Steele found is that when you meet failure, come back to yourself and focus on your values. So whenever I have a bad day at work, if I go home and think about my family and how much that means to me, it helps me to deal with this negative aspect in my life. So yourself is a bunch of parts. And if one part gets injured, you can help that injured part by focusing on another part of yourself that isn't injured. And that's what Claude Steele's work on self-affirmation tends to do. Okay? I didn't really, self-monitoring is not going to be on the exam, so we're not going to talk about it. Okay, so that's all I had to say. I did not mean to keep you for 40 minutes, but it looks like I have kept you for 40 minutes. Does anyone have any final questions? If you would, type in the chat bar and let me know that you don't have any questions, that you're still here. I see that we have 4 or 5 people on the feed, so which is a pretty big part of the class. I'm impressed. If you're on the chat bar, type me a hello. If not, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. The exam will be available in about 20 minutes, and you will be able to do the exam or the quiz. The quiz is due Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. And if you have any questions or problems, please send me a message and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, take care, have a great day, and I will see you next time in class.